Bottom line up front on this question about whether COVID-19 is going to change Iranian and Turkish regional ambitions is absolutely not. It's the nature of ideological dictatorships that they will remain committed to their regional ambitions no matter what damage it does to their citizenry at home. If they cared about their own citizens first and foremost, rather than some of their ideological adventures, the Middle East wouldn't be in some of the mess it's in today. I'll start by talking about Iran, and then I'll continue by talking about Turkey. I do just want to note how interesting it is. A decade ago, we might talk about what Iran and Saudi Arabia have meant or would mean for the Middle East. Today, at least in Washington and increasingly in Europe as well, it's consensus that what Saudi Arabia was in terms of an engine for radicalism in the 20th century, Turkey is in the 21st century. It really has replaced Saudi Arabia as Saudi Arabia started to recognize some of the problems of its past and some of the problems of its promotion of a more radical ideology. Switching back to Iran. I'm a historian by training, which means I get paid to predict the past. And admittedly, I only get that right about half the time. But I do want to just give some perspective of the broader, holistic Iranian strategy. And it is important to, A, differentiate between the Islamic Republic and Iran, but on the other hand, note where there's commonalities that won't change no matter what happens in Iran. I would argue that regime change is coming to Iran, and it's going to have nothing to do with the United States, Australia, or any other country. It's just a matter of natural attrition as the supreme leader, who's now 81 years old, faces his own mortality. He's already been treated for a prostate cancer. He is already partially paralyzed from a previous assassination attempt, and a lot of the old guard are dying, and it's not clear that there's a succession plan in place. What exists on paper and what might happen in reality are two very different things. I'll get back to that. At any rate, the thing to understand about Iran is they aren't a modern nation state that emerged in the 20th century. They've got a near contiguous history going back 2,000 years, and so they have what they call Iran Zamin. It's basically this notion of a greater Iran. The way that Vladimir Putin in Russia might look at the former Soviet Union as well as Eastern Europe, that's how not only the Islamic Republic, but ordinary Iranian citizens look at a lot of their neighborhood. I mean, after all, Baghdad used to be part of Iran. Bahrain used to be part of Iran. Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia used to be part of Iran. A lot of Pakistan and Afghanistan were as well. And so they figure that this is their area to muck about. Now, the point is, we've done surveying in the past where we take every telephone exchange in Tehran, randomize the last 4 digits so you get a good cross-section of society, ask about economic questions, and the Iranians culturally are very forthcoming. And what we find when we do the number crunching is about 10% of Iranians truly believe in the Islamic Revolution. Everything's going great. These are the so-called hardliners, or as they would say in Persian, the principalists, those who abide by the principles of the Islamic Revolution. Another 15% think Khomeini, the leader of the revolution, was on the right track. Things have gone awry, but they can be reformed. These are the reformists. The final 75% have completely given up on the system. That does not mean they're revolutionary, because last time they had a revolution, they ended up with a war that killed 1 million people. Now, here's the thing to keep in mind. If you're a leader in the Islamic Republic and you realize that the economy is, in the gutter and things have no room for improvement, but you also realize that most Iranians are fiercely nationalistic, it makes sense to sort of spark unrest in areas which you consider to be your domain. And that's Iraq, that's Syria perhaps, and elsewhere. I'm not apologizing for Iran's behavior. I'm just trying to go into some of their strategy. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that we think of Iran as the Shiite power. Iran is Shiite, Hezbollah is Shiite in southern Lebanon, and so forth. Iran's now mucking about with the Pakistani Shiites as well, a minority in Pakistan, as well as with the Afghan Shiites. They're making these ethnic militias, which are even showing up along the Golan Heights in Israel. Now, putting aside the fact that this is going to cause a problem when some of these battle-hardened people go back to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and so forth, you've got a situation in which Iran doesn't just see itself as Shiite. They see themselves as the Islamic power. And therefore, they don't hesitate to reach out. For example, when Mohammed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood head of Egypt, was in Egypt, they reached out to Egypt. Likewise, Morocco broke diplomatic relations with Iran because Iran was mucking about in Morocco as well. So don't limit ourselves mentally to this notion that Iran is only going to interact with the Shiite world. In fact, when we look at American casualties, for example, in Iraq, what we found from interrogation records and all sorts of other evidence that is accumulated, as well as the admissions of militia leaders, is that the Iranians were helping to subsidize the Iraqi militias. Now, one of the reasons why the regional ambitions aren't going to end, if we look at Iraq, we might say, hey, it's really expensive for Iran to involve itself in Iraq. But on my last trip to Iraq in December, one thing I was getting consistently was that the economic situation was so bad in Iran that instead of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps subsidizing the Iraqi militias, it was actually now reversed. The Iraqi militias and the businesses which they had established were now helping subsidize the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So you have that sort of relationship which the Iranians aren't willing to cut off. Now, Iran also sees itself as an ethnic protector. I mean, in Australia and in the United States, we have like a genetic basis of ethnicity. I mean, in the United States, we always have those forms. Are you African American, Hispanic, Asian, Pacific Islander, so forth, and you check the box. That's not how ethnicity works in the Middle East. Up until the 1920s and 1930s, it was geographically based. And an Arab was someone, for example, from the Arabian Peninsula. But Egyptians, Moroccans, Libyans, they weren't considered Arabs. Starting in the 1930s, it became linguistically based. An Arab was someone who spoke Arabic as their first language. A Persian was someone who spoke Persian. And remember, the national language of India before the 1830s was Persian. So the Iranians will also lean on that in order to sort of establish links. I mean, the big Indian evacuation from Qum over the last couple of weeks of seminary students was a bunch of Kashmiri Shiites who were studying in Qum. You have those links that we don't necessarily see. As visas tightened up for the United States and Europe, and perhaps with the hostage diplomacy we see ongoing with Australia, you've got a situation where a lot of Iranians will go to India to get their education. In fact, Ayatollah Khomeini's grandfather came from India. So you have those sorts of links which the Iranians are willing to play upon. Now, let me switch for a bit. In 2007, when it comes to regional ambitions, the Revolutionary Guard had a new leader at that point, a guy named Muhammad Ali Jafari. And he basically said, hey, look, I mean, Saddam Hussein is dead. The Taliban have been pushed back. He said the Israelis were a paper tiger, and I'm quoting now, the Americans couldn't do a damn thing. That's what he said. And therefore, he reorganized the Revolutionary Guard to put one unit in each province and made the Navy the main mechanism to project power. You had the first Iranian deployment to the Pacific Ocean since the 10th century. Now, you saw, I mean, one of my jobs is to work for the Foreign Military Studies Office at Fort Leavenworth, which is the US Army's open source intel shop. And when I traced the Iranian rhetoric, they went from describing themselves as a regional power, meaning just the Persian Gulf, to a pan-regional power. That meant the Northern Indian Ocean. And finally, they defined their boundaries as the Eastern Mediterranean and the Gulf of Aden. And we're certainly seeing that loom large. What I would just point out to before I shift briefly to Turkey is when I look at the future of Iran. I said that Iran is nearing regime change. And one of the things I think we need to worry about is the ascendancy of the Revolutionary Guard. When Khomeini died in 1989, there's a heat wave, and the quip on the street was, the old man was so senile, he forgot to close the door on the way down. At any rate, the reason why Khomeini became supreme leader was because he was seen as a weak figure, and Khomeini had the religious credentials to point to him and say, that's my man. Well, Khomeini doesn't have those credentials. Now, the Omanis pointed out to me that when Sultan Qaboos died constitutionally, they had to have a replacement in 2 days. The Iranians have a mechanism, but there's no timeline associated with it. So it's possible the Revolutionary Guard is just going to have an endless process in which they move in. And so if the Revolutionary Guard's in charge, one of our big intelligence failures of the last 40 years, we talk about hardliners versus reformers in politics, but we don't know about the factional divisions within the Revolutionary Guard. What we do know is that they have the money, and at least when we see Qasem Soleimani or his successor, Ismail Khani, they've been in that bubble since they were 10 years old. They are indoctrinated, and they're going to have the money, and they're going to have a much more streamlined operation because of it. It's a problem. Now let me shift very briefly to Turkey. Turkey went, when Erdogan came into power, from having a policy of no problems with their neighbors, that failed because they developed problems with all their neighbors, to this policy of neo-Ottomanism, reviving the Ottoman Empire. The problem with that was that the Turks had a much fonder remembrance of the Ottoman Empire than its subject peoples did. And they've moved on to basically a much more ideological agenda in which they've been focusing on Africa. But they've also, we've seen situations in the United States, in Europe, perhaps in Australia as well, I don't know, where Turkish-sponsored imams have been not only propagating a much more extremist interpretation of Islam, but also keeping tabs on Kurds and dissidents within their own country. I mean, you know the old Turkish joke, just to show how bad it's been, about one of the Turkish prisoners in the library goes into the prison library, and Turkish prisoners from the purge goes into the prison library, asks the librarian whether he can take out a book. The librarian apologizes profusely and says, I'm sorry, we don't have those books, we only have the authors. I mean, Turkey's basically become a police state, and Erdogan has been using all mechanisms of power, NGOs, charities, and so forth, in order to sort of make his grasp felt in a very negative way outside of Turkey. Now, just to show you how bad things have gotten, according to Turkey's own interior ministry, according to their statistics, since Erdogan came to power, the murder rate of women in Turkey has increased 1,400% because of the sense of impunity as you have this sort of basically ideology at play. The one thing I would keep in track with, and I'll conclude here, is one of the things that worries me most about Turkey is a group called Sadat, which is, if you're familiar with American Blackwater, it's like a Turkish Islamist Blackwater. They've been implicated in helping supply Boko Haram in Nigeria, in training al-Shabaab in Somalia, in providing weaponry to Hamas. The head of Sadat was President Erdogan's chief military advisor up until about a month or two ago. I mean, it's basically created this unaccountable militia, or I should say a militia that's accountable just to Erdogan, which has been conducting and operating, doing special operations, that sort of issue. So increasingly, some of those Turkey issues are also coming into play in a way where they're spreading an Islamism. Turkish air has been implemented in illegal weapons transfers and so forth in a way which is just deleterious. But I've talked a lot there. We can talk a little bit during Q&A about the future of Iran's nuclear program, the future of US policy towards Iran. I mean, certainly you have no better source than AIJAC people themselves. The Fresh Air report on analyzing the International Atomic Energy Agency reports on Iranian cooperation or lack of cooperation with inspectors. Rand Parat just had a great piece looking at ending Iran's nuclear masquerade now. I'd like to go into some of that as well, but why don't we do that in the Q&A?
Thank you very much for that fascinating talk, Michael. I really appreciate it. I actually might take the liberty of the first question or two. My first question relates to Hezbollah. As you are aware, and unlike many of our allies, the Australian government only designates the external security organisation of Hezbollah. What difference would it make if the Australian government moved to increase their designation of the whole organisation of Hezbollah, as the United States and Israel has urged?
Well, I mean, first of all, they're a terrorist group. And if Greenpeace put bombs on buses, it would still be a terrorist group no matter what it did in its PR campaign. And so it's time you call a spade a spade. With regard to Hezbollah, I'm thinking of a parallel when the United States designated the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in its entirety as a terrorist group. One of the reasons we did that was because the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has such a vast business empire, and it funds itself through those informal businesses, that by designating the entirety of the IRGC as a terrorist entity meant that if anyone was killed in a terrorist attack that was perpetrated by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the families of the victims or the victims themselves could go after those businesses which were associated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. When you don't designate an organization in its entirety, what you allow it to do is effectively play anti-accountability or anti-sanctions three-card Monty, where they will derive funds from a business, but they will deny any sort of accountability to that business, and it becomes an elaborate money laundering scheme in order to fund their terrorist enterprise. Unless you're willing to do it completely, you're simply not serious about doing it.
Thank you for that. And my second question, again, relates close to home. Australian academic Kylie Moore-Gilbert is imprisoned in Iran in what seems to be rather ridiculous circumstances and charges of espionage. What does history teach us as the ways that the Australian government should go about negotiating a hopeful release?
Well, you know, oftentimes the gut reaction, I mean, first of all, what's happened to Kylie is absolutely disgusting. And the fact that they tried to turn her as a spy just shows how cynical the Iranian strategy has been. What we see repeatedly, and from the American experience, is if you try quiet diplomacy, that's what the Iranians want. They want quiet so it goes away. But we've had the situation recently of Bob Levinson. And that's what, Bob Levinson, of course, was a visitor to Kish Island on Iran. He was arrested, he was in Iranian custody, and America's longest held hostage, and he ended up dead. Now, the point of this is when you have quiet diplomacy, the Iranians allow things to be swept under the rug. When you make a fuss, and when you make this front and center of every single diplomatic relation with Iran, when you make this front and center of every single commercial relationship with Iran, then that's when the Iranians listen. What allowed the American hostages to be released back on the first day of the Reagan administration wasn't the persistence of diplomacy. It was the fact that Iran's isolation meant that the cost of holding hostages was too great to bear. And so I would hope that Australia would take a tough line and convince some of its allies that they should stand in solidarity behind Kylie.
Thank you for that. First question for the audience will go to Philip Mandy.
Would you care to comment on the present and future relationship between Turkey and Iran?
It's a great question. There's a pragmatic relationship ongoing right now, but there's a limit to how far it will go. Erdogan has always been willing to work with ideological adversaries. First and foremost, Fethullah Gulen, with whom he had a falling out in 2013, until he figured his power was consolidated, he no longer needed them. With Iran, he needs them because Iran's the chief mechanism in order for Turkey to launder money. There's no better person to talk about that than Jonathan Schanzer, who I think AIJAC had as a featured guest just a couple weeks ago. The trade between Iran and Turkey is significant. Remember, Turkey does not require Iranians to have visas to come visit Turkey. Therefore, Turkey also becomes basically a den of Iranian espionage activities. And that Turkey has also been willing to play a very cynical game in a fit of pique a few years ago when Recep Tayyip Erdogan got upset at the Americans. Turkey leaked to the Iranians the identities of alleged Israeli spies working on the counter-nuclear program inside Iran. And so you do have a situation in which the two are willing to work together for a common goal, which is frankly a reactionary goal in the Middle East, very anti-American, anti-Israel, anti-West. But once that goal is put aside, then that's when they become competitors.
Okay, next question for Ida Lichter.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I've got a couple of questions. What is the state of the current relationship between Iran and China? And secondly, what do you think it would take to change Iran's adventurous behavior?
Okay, very good question. First, Iran and China. One of the slogans let me put on my history nerd cap for a second. Iran has always traditionally, even before the Islamic Republic, tried to find solace in the other power. So when Iran was facing in the 19th century, the British and the Russians, who did they turn to? The Austro-Hungarians were the ones who built up their army. Then when they got tired of the Austro-Hungarians, they turned to the Belgians. There was a whole big public uproar when the Belgian finance minister, finance advisor in Iran, dressed up like a mullah for Halloween. That's when they turned to the Americans. Now, there was a slogan when the Islamic Revolution happened, neither East nor West, but Islamic Republic. About a year ago, I think it was Jamhuri Islami, which is the paper most associated, means Islamic Republic, the paper most associated with the intelligence ministry in Iran. They had an op-ed, an unsigned, basically a masthead editorial, I think it was, asking whether the slogan neither East nor West really applied anymore. Wasn't the main problem the West? And even if you do have tremendous distrust of Russia among ordinary Iranians because of the historical animosity between the two, even though politically they're tight right now, there hasn't been that feeling. There's been that feeling that, we can reach out to China, and China's been willing to play their hand in that. And so you do have the Iranians and the Chinese working increasingly together. There's annual nanotechnology festivals, which the Chinese are working with Iranian companies on. The Iranians and the Chinese are working on other industries, including issues relating to satellites, ballistic missiles, and so forth. The fact of the matter is it's growing and it's a real problem. What the Obama administration tried to do, China had built, I'm not an oil industry guy, but Saudi Arabia has oil. Saudi oil tends to have a higher sulfur content, I believe, than Iranian oil. And China invested in order to have refineries to basically process Saudi oil. What the Obama administration tried to do was work through Saudi Arabia to pressure China on Iran, basically have Saudi Arabia tell Beijing, with some success, either you work with us, you buy from us, or you buy from Iran, but you don't do both. And there's a limit, however. I mean, unfortunately, what China's reaction has been to invest more in fracking, which makes them more independent of both, and therefore they don't have to fear those political energy levers quite as much. China, Iran, major problem. What would it take to get Iran to stop being adventurous? You know, I tend to agree with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's maximum pressure campaign. Some people say maximum pressure doesn't work, but I would say history shows it does. We've had two major issues in Iran where the Iranians have said they would never reverse course. One was what it would take to release the American hostages, and number two, what it would take to end the Iran-Iraq war. In the end, Khomeini released the hostages because Iran had gotten so isolated. And in 1982, we now know from declassified Iranian documents, the Iranians were considering, I mean, Khomeini was considering ending the 1980 to 1988 war 6 years earlier. But the Revolutionary Guard came to him and said, no, you got to continue, not only until you oust Saddam Hussein, but until you liberate Jerusalem. And the war continued for 6 years. It was a stalemate. Finally, Khomeini got up on the radio and he said, I'm quoting, it's like drinking from a chalice of poison, but I have no choice but to drink from this cup if the revolution is going to survive. What that tells me is if the economic pressure on Iran gets great enough, then you have the ability to get the Iranians to reverse course. What I would argue is lacking in our strategy, however, is whether the revolution, I mean, nightmare scenario for me is the Revolutionary Guard taking over. But even if the Revolutionary Guard doesn't take over, again, one of our intelligence holes is we don't know the factional divisions within the Revolutionary Guard. What are our strategies to fracture the Revolutionary Guard, to turn it in and of itself? When in 2007, they put one military unit in each province, we don't know whether the makeups of those units are native to the provinces in which they serve. If they are, that signals that ideology trumps kinship if given the order to fire in the crowds. If not, if they're rotating people around, that means that ideology is not strong enough. When I lived in Iran, one of the big fissures, was veteran services for war wounded. I mean, the Iranians are horrible treating their Revolutionary Guard veterans. I've tried to urge, I mean, in the military we learn every strategy, comprehensive strategy, has a diplomatic and informational, military and economic component. What I would argue we should be doing is sending, for example, our hospital ships to Dubai and the USNS Comfort, for example, and offer the Revolutionary Guard veterans free medical care. If they take it, that's an intelligence coup and a propaganda coup. If they don't, that just sows greater dissent within Iran. I do think in a nonviolent way, we should be putting pressure to make sure that the Revolutionary Guard doesn't stay as loyal as they are.
Thank you for that. Now, just a reminder, those that are wanting to ask a question, you can raise your hand by hitting the participant tab at the bottom of the screen, and then you'll see an option at the bottom of the list to raise hand. I will now flip over to Dr. Zvi Fleischer, the editor of the Australia-Israel Review.
Hi, Michael. Wonderful to have you here. I wanted to ask about the Pompeo visit to Israel, which is just going on, sort of the first COVID-19 diplomatic trip. They're going to talk about, obviously, the subject will be, a lot of the subject will be Iran. What sort of things do you think will be discussed? What sort of applications could there be? And what other issues do you think will be central to this visit, and which we look for as a result of it?
Well, I mean, Iran is always going to be on the agenda with regard to Israel, but I think at this point, there's some other things which are looming large, especially with regard to possible annexation of parts of the West Bank, the future of the Middle East peace process, as well as increasing U.S. unease about some of the Israeli dealings with China. I mean, oftentimes it's talked about in terms of just the government's dealings, government contracts with China. But when you look at Israel as the startup nation, the number of Israeli startups which are sold to Chinese interests that's of increasing concern to the United States as well. With regard to Iran, I mean, frankly, I think it's going to be same old, because the United States and Israel are on the same page. There's going to, I mean, again, you had in Fresh Air, you had that excellent analysis of the IAEA report highlighting Iranian refusal to cooperate. You've also had, I mean, Aaron Shapiro has talked about some of this in the press, and Ron Porat, I think just in the last day or two in the Times of Israel, had an excellent piece on ending Iran's nuclear masquerade now. I think there's going to be some really detailed conversations about the next steps, especially given everything which has been discovered from Israel's the archives they took from Iran. If I may step back just for a second and just talk about some of the significance of Iran's continued work, as well as the reason why the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was so bad. You've had over the thing that concerned me the most was just how it reversed precedent. And you had at the end of the Soviet Union, the legacy nuclear programs forfeit their nuclear weapons. Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan. Then you had South Africa in 2001 decide, in 1991, decide that they too were going to come out of the cold and forfeit their nuclear weapons program. And it took the International Atomic Energy Agency 18 years to give them a clean bill of health, with Nelson Mandela in power for most of that, fully cooperating. Because the IAEA needed to find, I mean, basically trace absolutely everything. Then in 2003, Libya's nuclear program was actually physically dismantled. I think if we want to look at the big picture of what Mike Pompeo is so concerned about is, I mean, how do you restore the non-proliferation regime if you have, under the previous Obama administration, if you had political pressure lead to its fundamental weakening? And that ultimately is what we're faced by. I mean, how do you deal with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the additional protocol to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that was implemented to tighten some of the loopholes? How do you address that if you have continued loopholes, such as UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which allows Iran to work on ballistic missiles under the guise of satellite launches? That's one of the big issues, which, I mean, on the broad picture is concerning Mike Pompeo, David Schenker, who's the Assistant Secretary of State, and so forth.
Thank you for that. Now we'll move on to Marcus Rubinstein.
Michael, thank you very much for your great talk. Just on your earlier point that COVID-19 won't change the ambitions of Turkey and Iran, given the massive economic fallout, what will happen with the Western world, with that economic preoccupation with rebuilding their economies, get in the way of their interest in Middle Eastern politics? And just as an aside, as a public policy expert, do you think the world and the major global powers will actually focus on preparing for the next pandemic, as we were hopelessly unprepared for this one? Or are there going to be other distractions, and will they just not have the money and drop the ball, so to speak?
Well, first of all, when it comes to this, I mean, the situation in Iran and looking ahead at the economic situation, I think Sharon Middleman had really done an excellent piece for you guys on could the 41st anniversary of the Iranian Revolution be the last? I mean, the COVID-19 crisis has really, it's shattered. The Iranian economy was already in trouble, and it's just shattered any hope of recovery on top of it. It's also shattered any remaining trust people have in the system, but the nature of the Iranian system is it's the guys with the guns that matter. Now, the reason why I'm not so sure that even the economic fallout's really going to matter much is because of the Revolutionary Guard. I mean, put aside the fact that, I mean, when some people say Iran is a democracy because they have elections, the way to think about it, imagine that in the Soviet Union they had elections, but only the Central Committee members were allowed to vote for Secretary General. That's the type of election Iran has. It's the guys with the guns that matter in the dictatorship. And the reason why we're in this situation and we're not simply going to be able to bail them out and use a commercial carrot and stick approach. And I had this exchange in the Atlantic a couple weeks ago, was because the Revolutionary Guard control 40% of the economy. And so all the money, all the manufacturing, all the electronics, all the oil work, all the infrastructure development, most of the department stores, they're in the hands of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And if you're doing business with them, you're pumping money directly into their pockets. Now, a way to think about this is the official budget of the Revolutionary Guard is around $5 to $8 billion per year. Now, last year I had the privilege of going out in the Strait of Hormuz on an Omani boat and watch the smugglers go back and forth between Oman, the Musandam Peninsula, and Iran. That smuggling accounts for another $13 billion per year. Now, most of those smugglers are good, honest, apolitical, hard-working, salt-of-the-earth smugglers. I mean, they're not particularly pro-Revolutionary Guard, but when they fuel up on the Iranian side, the Revolutionary Guard sells them gas at a 400% markup. And likewise, they need to pay landing fees and so forth. Then when you track some of these Revolutionary Guard businesses, these companies can get no-bid contracts. Last year, I think in the waterworks, they had more than $20 billion of no-bid contracts. In the oil works, sometimes it's upwards of $50 billion. What that basically means is if the Iranians had an epiphany that the Revolutionary Guard are a terrorist group, and the parliament was going to take their budget to zero, they would be facing less of a budget cutback proportionately than we did during the late Bush, early Obama years with sequestration when the Pentagon took a 10% across the board cut. 90% of the Revolutionary Guard budget comes from these business enterprises. And that's what's so problematic. As for your second question, I would note, from a US perspective, when I look at the last several administrations, let's start with George H.W. Bush, then Clinton, then Bush, then Obama, Trump. The national security or foreign policy crisis, which ended up being their legacy, was something that no one saw coming during the campaigns. George H.W. Bush was all going to be a domestic president and never saw that US forces were going to be in Iraq. Bill Clinton, it's the economy, stupid, and yet ended up sending forces into the Balkans, go figure, fighting a land war in Europe. Then George W. Bush was all about being a domestic president again and ended up not only back in Iraq, but also in Afghanistan. Barack Obama campaigned to quote unquote end stupid wars. And not only was he back in Iraq and still in Afghanistan, but we were in Libya and Syria as well. No one saw this pandemic coming, except ironically, maybe George W. Bush. But the fact of the matter is, unfortunately, it's a problem of the United States that we tend to be pretty myopic and have a short-term, we have a very short-term attention span. I hope we learn our lesson. What I could say comes out of this is not preparation for the next pandemic, but real focus on our supply chains to China and how allowing China to have supply chains not only with regard to rare earths, for example, something which, by the way, the Iranians talk about developing right now, their rare earth capacity. But even something so simple as personal protective equipment for medicine, that's something we're never going to put on China. Allow ourselves to rely on China for, again, food, same thing.
Thank you, Michael. And now on to David Adler.
Look, thank you very much for your interesting comments. I have a question about what you think the reaction might be from both Turkey and Iran in the event that Israel does proceed in accordance with the US peace plan and assert sovereignty in the Jordan Valley and parts of Judea and Samaria. Apart from the highly predictable, banging fists on the table and blustering, will they do anything on the ground that alters the current situation?
The short answer is, I mean, Turkey would like to supply and support Hamas more. I mean, ideologically, if you look at Turkey, you have Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and then you have this dissident cleric who lives in Pennsylvania, Fethullah Gulen. The basic difference between them is Recep Tayyip Erdogan comes from a Muslim Brotherhood background. Fethullah Gulen is an Islamist, but much more from a Sufi Anatolian school. Well, who else comes from a Muslim Brotherhood background? Hamas. So you would see Erdogan, I mean, shout till he's blue in the face, but I'm not sure he could really do much. Likewise, there's nothing the Iranians would do that they're not already doing. I think from an American perspective, at least, what worries most people is how the Jordanians and the Egyptians would react. Because the Egyptians and Jordanians have been pretty tight with Washington and would face opposition from people who might say, I mean, is this what you get from your close ties with the United States? Now, I'm less worried about Egypt in this regard. I'm more worried about the possibility of Turkey, or perhaps Iran, but more likely Turkey, sort of leveraging some of its assets in Jordan to cause unrest there.
Thank you for that. And Jamie Himes, Senior Policy Analyst at AIJAC.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks.
It's been very interesting so far. I'm just wondering, I note there's a new Prime Minister in Iraq who seems to be making some moves that Iran might not quite like. So I'm just wondering if you could shed some light on that, please.
Okay, well, I'm biased on this because I've known Mustafa Kadhimi for more than 20 years. He's a liberal. He's a former human rights activist who had the main, he was basically the main workhorse for cataloging documents that came out from Saddam Hussein's old documents to document his crimes. He never wanted this job. I mean, when he was appointed to be head of the Iraqi National Intelligence Service, he kept a very low profile, never gave press conferences, and very much professionalized the service. It's now seen as one of the, I mean, when you ask Iraqis, it's the service that's transcended sectarianism, that treats people fairly, that's least corrupt, doesn't engage in the types of human rights abuses, at least not with impunity, and so forth. Quietly, I mean, part of the reason why he was accepted as prime minister, whereas Adnan Zorfi, who I've also known for years, and Mohammed Alawi didn't get the nod, was because he also doesn't have his own political base. He doesn't have clear political ambition. The fact that he keeps himself out of limelight traditionally has meant that not only is he the intermediary, has he been for years, even before coming intelligence head, not only has he become the intermediary of choice when negotiating between Sunnis and Shiites and Arabs and Kurds, but also between Iran and the United States. Because a lot of our interaction, obviously, with the death of Qasem Soleimani plays out there. Now, that said, Mustafa Kadhimi is an Iraqi nationalist. He's between a rock and a hard place, no pun intended. 90% of Iraq's government revenue comes from oil. And one of the, I mean, Abdul Mehdi was a disaster. He's always been a disaster, but he basically expanded the government payroll, tried to buy love and affection on the basis of future generations, and Mustafa Kadhimi has to pick up the pieces. You also have a problem in which you do have these Iranian-backed Shiite militias. I would just say that not all the Shiite militias are Iranian-backed, and one of the things that we see happening in Iraq is a differentiation among Iraqis increasingly between those militias which were established because of the fatwa of Grand Ayatollah Sistani back in 2014 versus who were there basically to fight the Islamic State, versus those militias, many of which are backed by Iran, which predate that. And so they're no longer being seen as the Iraqi nationalist militias. And so that differentiation is the first, if you will, step to quarantining some of these Iranian militias. Frankly speaking, also, and this has nothing to do with Mustafa Kadhimi, Kataib Hezbollah, Asaib Ali al-Haq, some of these Iraqi militias. And I go to Iraq a lot. I've met the militiamen. I've met some of the militia leaders. It's not the same. I mean, Qasem Soleimani had a sway that wasn't easily replaced. Likewise, one of the things which most people don't recognize in the day-to-day reporting with regard to Iraq is that about 45% of Iraqis were born after the 2003 war. 45%. More than 2/3 were born after the 1991 war, Operation Desert Storm. What that means is that you've got a generation that has no functional memory of Saddam Hussein. And so while initially, immediately after the US-led invasion, which Australia, of course, did yeoman's work on, I mean, boots on the ground and everything, immediately after that, people were willing to flock to the Islamist parties, be they Shiite or Sunni, or the Kurdish nationalist parties, because they were the forbidden fruit. And they were willing to accept excuses for poor governance because at least we're not Saddam Hussein. The new generation isn't willing to do that. Now, I would also argue that when we look, and I'm sorry, you got me off the subject on Iraq, and I mean, it's a country where I spend the most time. You got a dream team really there right now, and so let's hope it works out. Barham Saleh, of course, is the president, British educated, lived in America. I mean, I know him from 1999. His wife used to work for the US Department of Agriculture. You have Mustafa Kadhimi, who's a British Iraqi, who has always been clean as a whistle. He has a background in intelligence. The new defense minister, I believe, is the former commander of the ground forces. And the new interior minister is the former chief of staff. And therefore, from a security perspective, these are guys who not only have a security background, but a security background that isn't involved with Iranian-backed militias. So that's a very positive development as well. And we've seen the US reaction has been to cut the Iraqis a little bit more slack, give them a longer waiver. The Iraqis spend a lot of money purchasing gasoline from Iran for electricity. The reason for that is because they have more electrical generating ability than they did during Saddam Hussein, but the population is nearing 50 million now. What the goal is for Western firms to basically allow Iraq to have capture flare technology in order to become gasoline self-sufficient, to wean themselves off having to work with Iraq. Now, what I worry about is this. I mean, I go back and forth, or I used to go back and forth to northeastern Syria, to the Kurds, most recently this past summer. I was in Kobani, I was in Raqqa, which was the Islamic State capital, which had been captured by the Kurds and so forth. And what Donald Trump did to the Kurds is inexcusable. And I worry about that this new strategic dialogue, which is supposed to start in Iraq next month, might provide cover for something similar. And that would be snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. It would basically cede Iraq to the Iranians. The Iraqis want to be nationalistic. They want to carve out their own space. And it would be an absolute disaster. But I mean, without commenting too much further, the United States administration isn't often the most predictable, which is one of the reasons why, frankly, Australia has become so important, because it really has the moral standard, which perhaps the shine has been taken off of on the United States to a bit of an extent.
Thank you for that, and appreciate covering Iraq as well. It's critically important in the region. Over to Colin Rubenstein.
Thanks very much, Joel. Look, I'm going to be unkind, ask you a couple of big ones, just following up on comments you've made, Michael. Firstly, on the China file, you've referred to the problem of supply lines, but Australia, of course, has massive trading relationship with China, but at the moment, of course, we have a few issues, problematic issues, to put it in a very gentle way. And we're wrestling with those, as so many other countries are. Israel also has built up a relationship with China. So I'm just wondering if you'd comment on whether Israel should be looking more seriously at its rather extensive involvements in terms of its own interests and that of its allies. And secondly, just following up on the Trump presidency and policy in the Middle East, there are clearly concerns that the US seems to be planning to withdraw its troops from Sinai and elsewhere in the Middle East, as it's threatened to do before and tends not to, and come back. I'm just wondering what the impact of such moves might be. And finally, you know, what difference would a Biden presidency make in terms of American Middle East policy?
Well, first of all, with regard to China, look, a lot of countries were calibrating, United States, perhaps Australia as well, were calibrating policy towards wishful thinking of what they wanted China to be rather than what it actually was. And I think we can count our blessings that Xi Jinping has showed everyone what the real China is. It's going to say, I mean, of course, I mean, China's overreaction to Australia in the last couple of days has been so counterproductive in all aspects. I mean, what we really need to do, and this is something for for an Australia-American dialogue, is to figure out how we can find new markets, because we can't rely on China, and no one should become as dependent on China as they previously were. With regard to Israel and China, basically look, I mean, sitting in Washington, the way the Americans think and the way the Pentagon thinks is technology being sold to China, which in the future could kill Americans? Because if America fights a war, a serious war, the only country we can envision fighting a serious war with in the future is China. And therefore, when you're trying to get into the mind of why the Pentagon is getting so worked up about this, they're getting worked up at the possibility not just of China spying on 5G or what might happen in the Haifa harbor or anything like that. They're getting worked up on, more broadly, any drone technology, any military technology which could ultimately be pirated. China doesn't have great respect for intellectual property rights, and utilized against the United States. With regard to the Trump administration, one thing on the Middle East, look, I support a lot of what Trump did on the Middle East, moving the capital to Jerusalem, long overdue, and so forth, annexing the Golan. What I worry about is two things. Number one, everything Trump has done is reversible by the next administration. I mean, I would like to see us tear down or sell the former US Embassy in Tel Aviv. I mean, Trump loves real estate development, so it's on Har Yarkon Street. Build a great hotel, sell it for $1 million. I mean, 20 million, 30, 40, $50 million. Or do what we do in Germany and elsewhere, where we have, in Hawaii, where we have American military, the Edelweiss in Garmisch, Germany, or the Halakoa in Waikiki, where we have US military sort of hotels, which are R&R places. Wouldn't it be great if all the US soldiers serving in the Middle East were able to go to Israel for R&R, especially because some of the rest and relaxation, especially because some of the problems we've had in the past is because of those in CENTCOM serving exclusively in Arab states get a very Arabist mindset. If we were able to transfer that diplomatic property into something else, all the better. With regard to Joe Biden, look, I know this is on the record, but I'll be blunt. The guy is dumb as a doorpost. I'm not saying Trump, I mean, he couldn't even be valedictorian of the summer school class. I mean, Trump, of course, isn't an intellect either, but we need to focus less on what Biden might do, because over the course of his career, he's done absolutely everything. I mean, both sides of everything. But we need to focus on who his advisors are. And unfortunately, with statements over the last couple days restoring Palestinian salary payments, even though these have been going to terrorists and so forth, that's a major problem. If we have the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party moving into Biden's policy shop and having his ear, that's going to be a major problem. And let's also face it, Biden is what, 78 years old? Who he picks as vice president is going to be hugely important, whether that comes from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party or the more mainstream. Now, the frustration here as I watch American politics is, of course, Twitter amplifies everything. And so if you just focus on Twitter, it seems that young people in the Democratic Party are all in line with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Ilhan Omar or Bernie Sanders or Rashida Tlaib. But when you actually talk to most Democrats, they're not. Now, what I would hope is that Biden's shop recognizes that he can't throw out the moderates in order to appease a progressive wing, which frankly is not appeasable.
That's a very critical point. Final question will go to our Director of International and Community Affairs, Jeremy Jones.
Thank you, Michael. Now, just an easy one. What more can Australia do to help with the problems with Iran and with Turkey?
You know, I mean, Australia, my frustration with Australia is this. Australia has much more moral authority and weight in Washington than I sometimes think Australian governments realize. An American-Australian relationship, for many reasons, I'd say is getting to the point where it's surpassing the strength of the US-British relationship. And I would like to see Australia be a little bit more active with its moral clarity, and frankly, it should demand more from us as well in terms of help with regard to China. Look, America increasingly relies on Australia. We have our Marines up in the north, and you know that I teach on the carriers and on the amphibs whenever they deploy. And when they get a port, I've never been able to get a port call in Australia because I'm usually flying off before that. But when they get a port call in Australia, I mean, that's the highlight of their career. And that's the type of leverage that I think Australia has and should use. I would hope that Australia, look, Australia intelligence recognizes what's going on. They've had incidents in the past. They certainly recognize what the Iranians have tried to do in Australia. I would just urge, despite all the cooperation sometimes that comes around Anzac Day, that they recognize how malevolent Erdogan has become and how he's leveraged some of his irregular actors in Western democracies. It's something which Australia should be very, very concerned about, especially given Australia's Kurdish community.